So this is my breakdown of what are the different steps with learning engineering. With research, everything's about how specific you can get, how systematically you can plan it, and how cleanly you can execute it. That's like the three golden rules of research. Learning engineering is not much different. Everything with learning engineering is focused on what data you're collecting and how can you use it to inform your product design. So the very first step is to decide the purpose of why you're engaging in this. Is this simply to test for efficacy? Is this to test if a specific feature is more useful? Is this to test, hey, what's the user experience? It is important for you to decide what is the purpose of that specific learning engineering project as you're starting out, because that can influence decisions further down the lane. A second step for learning engineering is to decide the frequency of data collection. Are you going to be able to collect data on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, on a monthly basis? This is also important not just for you to actually collect the data, but to double check that your database actually stores it for that long. I think some of the earlier startups have a tendency to clear up our data spaces so we don't use it too much, and that can sometimes be an issue if you actually need data going back a month. You also want to be thinking about what is the timeline for the goal when you're thinking about how frequently you want to collect data. If you are planning your next version out in 2 months, you're not going to be able to collect data for a full month and then analyze it and then iterate and then move through. So you want to think about what are the stakes attached to that decision. If it's a high stakes decision, you want more data. Depending on how many users you have, that could be a short time, but it could also mean you want to plan ahead of that big decision date to actually collect that data. The third step is to decide the outcomes and outputs that you want to measure and track. Step 4, we're thinking about, can you measure these outputs? Can you measure these data in your platform? The audit and plan is basically you taking stock of what data do you need? What data are you already collecting? What data should you be collecting? When and how? It's basically you just working through the data trail to see, do you have everything you need in place? If not, what do you need to fix? How long would that take? You also want to check when you're doing the step 4 of audit and plan that your data is speaking with each other. That one database has, let's say, student ID. That same student ID is being connected into another database if you have multiple databases. So be sure that you are collecting the right pieces of data, but they're also syncing together in a clear way. Think about it like when you're using HubSpot. You want to have consistent information for all your customers, so it all syncs up neat. It's the same thing when you're doing learning engineering. You want all of the student and teacher data to be identified using a single ID number across databases so you can easily pull in through them. The fifth step is the implementation. Implementation can happen with your technical engineers if you're thinking about how do we bring in this information or how do we collect this information from the platform. I would also recommend reaching out to a researcher ahead of time, whether it's us at EdTech Recharge or someone else interested in your field, to double check that you have chosen the right kinds of data points that you're collecting and that you're collecting enough data points to actually run or test the assumptions you want to test. After that comes the analysis and application pieces. Analysis is ideally always supposed to be guided by the assumptions you're testing. And this is why your assumptions worksheet is like a gold mine, right? You want to write down, I'm collecting all of this data. Think about your purpose. What are the related assumptions? Then analyze, keeping in mind those assumptions. Are you allowed to do exploratory analysis? Absolutely. But the more intentional you are, the more specific and actionable your data and your insights are going to be. That takes us to that last step of actually applying the findings we get from the data to do two things. One, either you're thinking through, hey, I didn't really get what I wanted, so maybe I'm thinking about the wrong outcomes, or maybe I'm thinking about the wrong way to collect these outcomes. Or you're going to be rethinking, hey, maybe the design needs to be tweaked, or perhaps even the product itself needs to be tweaked. If you're like, hey, my method is strong, my outcome definitions are strong, my product design needs to change. This is what Duolingo does with their algorithm piece, is when they test these A/B testing, they compare final learning outcomes between the two to see which is a more efficient way of learning, which is a more effective way of learning, and then implement that into their bigger and broader program design. The entire goal of learning engineering process is very focused on, yes, we have some evidence upon which you've constructed your logic model, but learning engineering will help you test if those assumptions about the evidence being relevant to your product actually is true or not for your specific use case scenario.